Well, hello and welcome, everyone. I know we are joined by people from all over the world at the last session of the World Bank's Fragility Forum. I'm Raj Kumar. I'm the president and editor-in-chief of DevX. Honored to have been asked to moderate both the first session and now the closing session of this unusual forum, in that this is normally a gathering in Washington, D.C. of leaders and experts and practitioners who care about issues around violence and fragility and conflict and see them as core to the development mission and achieving the sustainable development goals, and want to find practical solutions forward. This year, the organizers of these events had to pivot, like so many of us, move them online. I think there have been 60 sessions and some 200 speakers. It's been really a labor of love. We've been pleased at DevX to help support this. And I know that many of the people in this audience have really followed many of these sessions. It's achieved some real attention in our community, and rightly so. So today we've got a fantastic group of panelists. We're going to have an open conversation, try to get into some of the same core key issues we've heard throughout the Fragility Forum, but also try to get some perspectives to help us wrap up the many sessions that have happened to this point. And obviously, fragility is a topic those of you joining us around the world know well. But COVID-19 has changed the game in some ways. This is the first time since 1998 we're likely to see a significant increase in global poverty. More people are displaced, more people pushed into fragile situations. Much of the news, in my business, in the news media, much of it is dominated by the advanced economies and how they're faring with COVID-19. But the truth is, many of the most fragile countries in the world will see the brunt of this and the long-term effects of it, even if the case numbers today don't show up on those red and white maps that we see in our news coverage every day. So we're going to have a good discussion, I think, today about what the way forward is. And I just want to take a moment to introduce you and welcome our fellow panelists for the conversation today. And please just please welcome them virtually in your hearts, since we can't hear you clapping from all over the world. But Osman Diagana is the Vice President for West and Central Africa at the World Bank Group. Those of you from the bank know him well. He spent quite a career there. He's been a vice president in the past of different departments within the bank, and the chief ethics officer, and vice president of human resources. And now, as we reported at DevX maybe a year ago or so, he has taken over this new regional vice presidency for West and Central Africa, an area he knows very well, having served as a program manager and a country director across the region. So we're going to hear a lot from him specifically about that. We have as well with us Amat Alim Al-Soswa, and Amat is someone also from these Fragility Forum conversations, former Yemeni human rights minister and former assistant secretary general at the UN, has worn many hats through her career and has dealt a lot in countries that face fragility. And so we're really eager to hear from her. And then, of course, Allison Evans, another name from our pages at DevX, who has worn hats over the years, including leading ICAI, the Aid Impact Independent Commission in the UK. She directed the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, in the UK, and now is Director General of Evaluation at the World Bank Group. So I'm looking forward to a really rich conversation with all three. And maybe, Osman, I can just begin with you. Given the region you're responsible for, sadly, there are many countries in the region that face fragility. I think about Mali, for example, and what's happened there with the coup just in the last days. How do you think about these issues today, given the region that you are now responsible for? You've just taken over this vice presidency quite recently. How do you think about these issues? And give us kind of your opening thoughts as we begin the discussion.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Raj, and thanks for accepting actually to moderate this panel. And also, I'm very delighted to join those very eminent personalities. Alison is a great colleague. I have not known Amatlin, but having spent almost 4 years in Sana'a, in the World Bank office in Yemen, it's always a pleasure actually to meet and share panel with the Yemenis. This is a country that is very, 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 very close to my heart. So this is a very important agenda. FCV is at the center and front for the bank mission. And obviously for West and Central Africa, it's at our core issue. I like to mention that the bank is a mission-driven institution and it's a value-based institution. As a mission-driven institution, our role is really to create all the conditions and to make to level the playing field for everybody, in particular for those who are really struggling to have access to basic services and to create the condition for shared prosperity. So this is why the bank has been established. This is what is its mission. And obviously, values is very important to us. And in fact, having access to basic services like education or health is first and foremost also human right. So, and this is what values eventually means. For me, as a vice president of a region in which more than 50% of countries are FCVs, obviously our task and our responsibility are daunting, but in the same time we do have the obligation to make it to make it work, and it's therefore.
We may have lost you for a moment, Osman. I'll just mention as
Well,
perhaps your connection comes back to us.
Indeed, I was getting
that mission you were. Maybe you're getting a call from a prime minister in your region, looking to close it, looking to close a deal. I just want to mention that while I have your attention there. First of all, your camera is off. I don't know if you're able to turn it on, Osman, but you talked about the mission, and it is particularly important because
I didn't realize that my camera was off. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. Yeah, I mean, working in these fragile countries that you're responsible for in your region, these are countries, particularly we see it during the COVID-19 crisis, that simply don't have access to finance from traditional sources, from private sources. They rely on the bank, and they rely on the bank's leadership. We see that as countries during the pandemic open the fiscal space where they can, and especially fragile countries have such a hard time doing that. Please continue. Go ahead now that we have you back.
Indeed, yes, I was mentioning that this is in a region where we have about 50% of our country that are categorized as FCV. And even those that are not FCVs, the negative externalities of the neighbor countries, of course, impact on the living condition of the population and on the development trajectory of the countries. Therefore, our approach, as this approach that we are trying to promote, is two things. One is to focus on what I would call on space dimension, because we do have, if you like, in West and Central Africa, we have a Sahel that are at the core of the western part. We have the 5 Sahelian countries that have been defined or identified as a G5 by the international community. But even those countries that are not part of the G5, for several reasons, be it related to geography, demography, ecology, etc., are almost, G5 countries. It's hard to make a difference between Senegal and Mauritania, for instance. It's extremely difficult to make any difference between Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso. It's extremely difficult to make a difference between Cameroon and Chad. Yet, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and Cameroon are not categorized as being part of the G5, the Sahelian country. So this is just to say that, our support to this special dimension that you are taking vis-a-vis the Sahel country, of course, go beyond those G5. We need to, because the spillover dimension is there. And the second aspect, which is extremely important, is the sectoral dimension. There are key sectors, and I start to refer to that are fundamental. And if we don't create the condition for people to have access to those sectors, obviously their living condition will not be positively impacted. I mentioned education. I talked about health. water, of course, the governance, which is not a sector, which is actually a foundational element to create the opportunity for people to have access to services, the social accountability, etc., etc. So those are elements that we are trying to focus on in order to help actually to better first to better, we do that in having look at more carefully what are the drivers of fragility, and then to try to address those issues through analytics, through finance, and of course through technical assistance, so that those issues can be addressed. So let me stop here. Thank you.
I want to get into those issues, the driving factors, what we know about them with Allison Evans in a moment. But just to underline a point you made about negative externalities and which countries count as G5 Sahelian countries, which ones don't. So much of the reason why the World Bank and all of us in the development and humanitarian sectors now have to coalesce around the fragility agenda is one fragile country can lead to displacement, refugees, that spill into another. That fragility can spread. And I think that's your point about negative externalities and neighbors, especially in the region that you're responsible for. Allison, maybe you can join the discussion, because Osman was describing the idea that we have some sense of which sectors are really important, including governance, cross-cutting themes like that. How much do we know today about what works and what doesn't? A big theme of the Fragility Forum has been evaluation and study. How much do we know about what we can do to actually address these core underlying issues?
Thanks, Raj, and thanks for everyone for inviting me to this panel. It's great to be alongside Osman and Matalaim. Okay, so what do we know? Well, I think it would be presumptuous of me or anyone at this point to sort of say that we absolutely fully understand all about what works and what doesn't in conditions of fragility, of conflict and violence. We know more than we did. We have a better handle, I think, on some of the ways to avoid doing harm in these environments, but we possibly know not as much as we should about really what drives for more successful and sustainable and resilient outcomes, particularly for the most vulnerable populations. Now, having said that, I think from the work that the World Bank and others are doing now on really pivoting their diagnostic tools to understanding some of these core drivers of fragility and vulnerability, of really focusing their attention on understanding not just the intended effects of development operations, but also those unintended effects, and really trying to build in that understanding to design and implementation of development interventions. All of those things, I think, are really positive developments, but there are still very significant gaps in our understanding, and there are reasons for that. And those reasons range from the fact that conditions on the ground in many fragile and conflict affected contexts just change a lot, and therefore getting a good fix through conventional sources of data on what is happening and to whom can actually be genuinely very, very challenging. Very often the situations that development actors are trying to target in these environments are actually fairly atypical. This is not an environment in which you go to the shelf and say, well, we have a set of kind of pre-cooked solutions that we know work somewhere, and therefore they surely must work in these kinds of environments. I think through the evaluation lens that we have, through research data, we know that that's often not the case. And finally, we're also working in an institutional context where there is an acute shortage of data, particularly high frequency data, the kind of data that is relied upon to really orient development interventions and adjust and adapt those interventions over time to be able to achieve outcomes. So there are many reasons why understanding what works is quite challenging. I think we have to also resist the temptation to look for best practice rather than taking a more problem-solving approach to delivering development support. And we do need to address these fundamental issues of data and of capability to assess data in real time in order to really be able to guide and orient ourselves towards the most important issues.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from you, Alison, is the context is so important, and that it's easy for us perhaps to fall in the trap of becoming like global consultants who pull from the shelf that best practice and say, let's fly somewhere and apply this practice here, and not really understand the local context and what the real drivers are. Is there more understanding of this issue, of this kind of pitfall? Do you feel today? Do we
Yes,
have a better
I
sense
think
within our community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so, and I think it's important to slightly moderate the view that, well, if everything is so context specific, then we have no, opportunity to really draw and learn on experience from different contexts. I don't want to give them that sort of impression. I think the point is that everything we learn, be it lessons through evaluation or insights through research, we have to put through the filter of, is this relevant? Is this fit for purpose in the context within which I'm working? And remember, it's not just country context. It's often down to community context. It really gets quite challenging. And so I think it just requires us to think twice before making the assumption that, well, we've seen it work somewhere else, it'll work here. Put it through the filter, expose it to the kind of rigorous analysis of context. Things can indeed replicate, but we've just got to make sure we're very careful on how that happens.
Yeah, we're hearing that do no harm message come through loud and clear from you, given your experience and your role. I wonder, I was supposed to bring you in the discussion. One of the tensions is similar to the one we just heard from Alison, is you hear from many humanitarians or development professionals, well, these fragility situations are up to the diplomats. I think about the case of Yemen, your home country. These are geopolitical issues. These are kind of above our pay grade in the development humanitarian sector. On the other hand, people like Osman saying, hey, we have to work on health and education and clean water. We have to get these things done, almost regardless of the diplomatic or political dimensions. How do you see this? And maybe you can use the example of Yemen and what's happening there now to help inform our discussion today.
Able to join.
I think you were muted. There we go.
Okay. My pleasure. First of all, that I am like you, Raj, have been invited to participate in the closing session of the Fragility Forum. And I'm especially happy that I'm also joining our dear colleagues, Osmani, Alison, Caroline, yourself, and the rest of the other unknown soldiers behind the screens who make it possible for us really to appear for the world. Well, I agree fully with Alison and also Osmani in regards to looking at every context as well, every country context, as if it's by its own, even if we are going to tackle the issue of fragility, conflict, and violence, because there is no also size looks like the rest or like the all other sizes too, even in that regard. And this is a very important really a lesson that we have learned also from the regular and under also the development circumstances, even without having fragility, because oftentimes, as you know, development designers, by the nature of their job, they would like really to see results, and they also tend to get also from the shelf, as Alison mentioned, to then try to disseminate it, try to implement it somewhere else. But of course, these lessons learned, all these successful stories, but most importantly, the failing as well stories that we all have to learn from, because simply we are here at this particular conjunction of the history and also of realities on the those fragile contexts, because oftentimes we all haven't learned so much from the lessons. So that's a very, very important really thing to focus at. Secondly, again, talking about the drivers of the fragility and the conflict as well, and to tend, instead of just being in a reacting mode, to be able to really participate very actively and to prepare to prevent any sort of falling down in this trap. And through this, of course, we can learn how to be really ready, for example, to face some of those major crises that has striking now the world. And it's very, very important to know that pre-COVID, I think where the humanity now will come to register pre-COVID era, whether it was for the most advanced developed countries or whether it is also for the most underdeveloped in countries as well, where also the fragile and the fragility and the conflict have become really a sign of our modern times. It is very important to learn also from those very important and global contexts, because the failure in the case of any given fragile context, for example, in responding to the development challenges, to the questions of governance, to really learning from as well what has gone wrong, what has gone right as well. I think it should be also applicable for the international and the multilateral as well organizations, because oftentimes, these are also the guys who have the money. And it is very, very important to also refer to the idea that it's not only the solutions to the questions of development, especially in fragile contexts, it doesn't mean that it's most of the time or it has to be based on only providing the finance for development, because we have seen in so many contexts, and I will take the liberty, of course, of talking about my own country. I mean, it's not a secret, as you know, that also, although Yemen has not been put at the most favorite, place when it comes to paying or giving donations per person, per population growth and ratios.
It's been forgotten in many ways, I think, as a crisis.
Exactly.
That's what you're referring to, right?
Yeah, but also at the same time, I mean, if you look also at the amount of money, for example, let's talk about the World Bank, since we are here and talking today about how to learn from what we have been doing in the last few decades. So even if you just want to focus on Yemen from 2016 until today, which is really the year that has succeeded the first year of violence in Yemen and conflict, until today, IDA itself only has spent something that is no less than $1.775 billion. These are all to Yemen in form of grants, as you know. And of course, they have been dispersed in the most needy, most important and urgent as well arenas, like, for example, vaccines for children, especially from cholera prior to COVID, of course, and also providing and helping as well the destroyed also infrastructure of the country, especially health, education, other services. Also, it has made it sure that at least 9 million people has been able to receive a form of income on the level of the social protection schemes, which also on the other way, it's very, very important to see. I mean, all these objectives are critical, essential, very important, but at the same time, you have to look at what's coming out of this. So now we have COVID, which has stricken Yemen like every other country. But of course, in the case of Yemen, given also the level of violence and conflict and disintegration, if you will, of some national authorities or absence of some of that sort, even if the bank and so many other international organizations, and here I'm focusing on the bank because also the bank has been very active and very generous as well in terms of supporting all the UN work, or most of the UN work, including and going all the way through post-COVID, where it has supported Yemen from the second day, if you will, when the announcement of those grants to helping really the response to COVID. And again, the basic lesson here is it is, no matter how important or essential it is to continue to focus on the humanitarian level, it is vital. It is vital to spend even half of this amount of money by all donors to actually connect this nexus between humanitarian and between development, because you need also a form of, even for the population as well, to feel more self-reliant, more of encouraged.
Let me understand this.
Yeah.
Let me understand your point here, because you said there's 1.7 billion in grants provided by the bank during this period of conflict.
From IDA,
you said a lot of it did. Yeah, and it went to things like hospitals, right, and to roads. And isn't that development work? And I want to get into this with you because, I also want to bring Osman back, but briefly, because this definition of what is development, what is humanitarian, is, I know, a big theme of the Fragility Forum. Why isn't that itself development work? Why doesn't that meet your definition?
I'll tell you, because also Yemen has been going and undergoing this very violent conflict. So, for example, you wanted to see that the continuity, for example, of providing water services, clean water services, sewage systems, to making it possible really for the majority of the population to be able to avoid cholera and other, spread malaria, dengue fever, and other infectious diseases as well. And I'm here talking about and pre-COVID. I mean, here it's very, very important. But also because you are starting from a very, very lower point, because you have to look also at the level of poverty, also all these violent and conflict times in Yemen, and to see that the level of the poverty has almost reached almost 44% of the entire population. This is prior to COVID and the rest. And also the unemployment rates amongst youth, amongst women, the attention which hasn't been paid also equally to the informal sector, as you know, which is not, again, and also because it is rather very essential to also engage with the people on the ground, wherever they are, at the local community level, at the level of the local authorities, the central governments, wherever they are, and to be able to have this dynamic way of shifting and moving. As you know, I mean, the work of development per se in its proper form and way requires only that you only deal with one central national government, that it's not possible for the same authority to exist and to be there in all governorates, where also you have a massive as well displacement of the people. If you have 4 million people who are internally displaced, who are also becoming victims, not just of all the war and its consequences, but also climatic change, floods, heavy rains, other, droughts at previous time. So this is why it's very important to have a different, really, mood, if you will, of working very, very genuinely, and most importantly, to work with the people and to give them this sense, not just of pride, because they are there and they are more capable actually to manage, the situations around themselves. It's very, very important to focus on that.
I see your point, and Osman, I want to get you in on this conversation because the point that Ahmad is making eloquently here is that we have in the humanitarian sector the idea of going and putting a Band-Aid on a problem. We have to solve a problem. The patient is ill. We need to solve this issue, but it's different than having a development strategy and saying, how do we get off of our back foot and become a forward, growing, positive outlook kind of a situation for the population, to give them some hope and some future, not just deal with the humanitarian crisis. At the same time, in a region like the Sahel, where you operate, Osman, you have the same trends that Ahmad mentioned about the climate, desertification, drought. You have so many interconnected issues at the same moment. How can we get ahead of those and build a positive, forward-looking development strategy that gives people hope when it feels like we're constantly in the humanitarian mode?
Yeah, indeed. I think all the point that you have made Amal, I could not agree more. And Raj, what you are saying actually represents, from my perspective, the dark side of what we can see in Sahel, the impact of the climate, the geographical challenge, the fact that countries are very, very large, population are, you know, spares, and access to water is extremely difficult. But we sometimes tend to forget that there are also a lot of positive side in countries that are affected by fragility, and that those countries before being in the current situation used to be years ago very stable countries because they had been relatively well managed, building on the potential that they had. In fact, if you take the Sahel, for instance, this was actually in 18th or even 19th centuries. You know, the area in Africa where institutions were extremely strong. Okay, it's the country where there are strong leadership. It's a country where education was valued. I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, at what point actually those countries, the dynamic has shifted from countries that were relatively stable, the population happy given their context, and today being in a situation where everything is absolutely extremely challenging. The framework that we have now in the bank is the called risk and resilience assessment, actually provide an excellent opportunity to better understand those elements. And if the analysis is not clear and well conducted, you know, the solution will not be responsive to the problem that we face. I think what we do see, even it's not vis-a-vis of the bank, vis-a-vis the whole international communities. For the last 20 years, the amount in terms of dollars, if you like, that have been transferred to country has continuously increased. But the solutions to bring back resilience and create the condition for prosperity, etc., have not always worked. And this is certainly because the assessment and the analysis was not strong enough. I think today we are in a better position with a variety of tools and analysis that we are using. Today we know that that fragility result from a lack of effective governance, and therefore investing on those soft dimensions is as critical as investing in what we call hard area, building school, road, etc., bridge, etc., etc. So institution is fundamental, and you cannot contribute to building strong institution if as a population are not involved. What type of institution they are looking for their country? So I think this partnership at the local dimension is a fundamental. I think we have to partner with the populations themselves to do what could work for Yemen, for instance. It's not necessarily the model that we have in France or in Emirates will not be necessarily probably the type of model that we need to replicate in Yemen. So it's the Yemenis who have to do this type of assessment and to come up together as a society to say, okay, based on our history, based on our culture, based on our exporting capacity, and this is the type of institution, the type of government that we are looking for. The second dimension that we have is...
Can I just say, yeah? Can I just get Alison Evans in on this point? Because, Asmad, you're making an interesting point here, which is looking at the history of countries that today are considered fragile. and saying there was a point when these countries actually were stable and where they were well governed. Maybe there's many examples probably on both sides of that, but your point is there is some history we can look to that gives us some hope about the future. At the same time, some people would argue that the dynamics have simply shifted. They are fundamentally different today than they were in the past. That with the climate changing as rapidly as it is, and with young population growth booming, where young people don't see a future for themselves, and now populations have dramatically expanded beyond the ability of basic infrastructure to serve them, clean water and sanitation, or hospitals, or roads, or education, that we're simply at this breaking point, and that we can't see that positive future. It's not about more data or analysis, that we need to do something much bigger and different. Alison, I want to bring you in because you earlier were talking about the lack of data. You were saying we have some idea what works, but we need to study it more. Are we at a different moment now where it's not about analysis, it's not about data, it's about a much bigger vision that's required? Or do you think Osman's point that there was an era we can look back to, there is a possible future, a development paradigm that will work for even the most challenging countries? Where do you sit on this, having spent so much of your career studying these issues and thinking about aid impact?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I take your point well there, Raj. I do think we probably are at a bit of a tipping point, but I don't think that sort of obviates the need for us to continue to invest in our understanding, but crucially, actually, more than as a development community, we need to support the understanding of local institutions, of local actors, the capabilities of local institutions to be able to begin to understand how best to support local populations. And following Amma's point, this is absolutely, the engagement of local populations in this vision, in this trajectory of change, is absolutely fundamental. I mean, if we look through the work of IEG over the last number of years, and also it resonates, I think, with other development institutions, 4 areas where engagement is absolutely fundamental, I think, for achieving any kind of progress. And they kind of form the building blocks a little bit of that forward trajectory, Raj, you were talking about. So 4 areas that we note from our evaluations that really are essential: building and rebuilding the capacity of states and institutions. I mean, the institutional change agenda is so hard, very often very difficult to measure progress, long gestation periods, but so fundamental that we should never turn our backs on that. But I'll come to in a moment maybe some reflection on how rather than just what in that regard. Delivering vital basic services and building the capacity of people to take charge of their own destinies, absolutely fundamental. It's not that it hasn't been done, but it needs to be seen as part of a kind of coherent vision and strategy linked to also supporting the private sector to create jobs and expand economic opportunity. And finally, fundamental, paying special attention to issues of gender. I think through all of this, I think we've just shown time and time again that is so fundamental. But these kind of elements just confirm the sort of the direction of travel, the areas that need support and building of capacity. But I think we need to turn our attention much more also to the how, to the implementation of particularly of development interventions. And we've spent a lot of time fixating on, quality of design, for example, as evaluators would call it, in the process of putting together interventions. And that is important, don't get me wrong. Having a really strong fit for purpose theory of change, really fundamentally important. But I think what we're also recognizing is that implementation itself is a change agent. How things get done, the extent to which you engage communities, the extent to which you can really bring in perspectives that are not ones that are governed by development actors, but are actually locally driven. The more that you can focus on local institution building, those are the sorts of things that start to tip the balance. And we as a development community need to take some responsibility for having, at times, imagined that just the well-intentioned external support will drive change. And I think we're now increasingly aware that we need to focus much more fundamentally on the nature of the development process within these countries and how external intervention can work with the grain of change and build and support local action rather than the other way around.
Right. These are resource problems, but they're not simply resource problems. If you can bring in all the development aid in the world, but that alone won't get to the fundamental issues if there's conflict, for example. And I think this is very much what Amat was getting at earlier in talking about the need to involve local populations, even in places where the central government really doesn't have authority, where it's not so easy because you can't just make a World Bank loan to that central ministry and expect that you're going to get the problem solved. You need to do some of the really hard work, as you described, of building that local capacity, which is not easy, but it has to be done. Osman, I cut you off earlier. You were making a second point, and I want to give you a chance to get to that. As we hear this theme, I think coming through very clearly from all of you with all of your experience in these issues, that we have to get more and more local, to get more and more to the voices of people affected and bring them into the process. That's fundamental. It's not just a nice thing to do, it's fundamental to this work. Osman,
indeed.
What can you add to this?
Indeed, actually, just to add the 2 points to complete my earlier intervention and to react quickly to the point that Alison was making. I think the second point, especially in the context of Sahel, is the contestation of natural resources. In each of those countries, you take Mali, you have gold, you take Chad, you have oil, you take Niger, you have uranium, you take etc., etc. And the control, the fight of the controlling access to those natural resources is a huge source of instability. And we didn't pay enough attention before, a couple of years ago, to better understanding this issue. I think today we are doing more work on that. And in fact, when you look at the portfolio of the World Bank in each of those countries now, you have more and more programs and projects in the area of governance, social accountability, etc., and also, managing of natural resources. The third dimension, the one is the issue of demographics. Many of us, this is in a space both Sahel and the Chad-like, where the population growth, is more than 3.3% per year. So there is a risk of seeing the population double every 20 years, almost, with a huge consequence on investment and what type of investment to make, and where, especially if you combine this with the size of the countries. Okay, on average, each country in Sahel is more than 1 million kilometers square. You can see actually the challenge of building road there, building bridge, etc., etc. Now, having said that, I think as a development institution, we are relatively good at providing technocratic solution. We do have the expertise. We know if there is a need to finance and to build the bridge, or to create conditions for increase access to water, etc., etc. We do have the resources and we have technical expertise to do that. But what we don't, in the area where we are not very good at is the culture of the population for using those type of investment and the values that they could pay to that. I think this is where I will come back to the point that I have made earlier. I think it's the identification of the critical need of the population and prioritizing this in order to define in terms of sequencing what type of devolution solution to be put in place should not be actually conducted by the donors themselves. I think here we have a very fundamental role to play in creating conditions for the population at the local level to come together and to try to support them through a smooth, to have a smooth process that will allow them to identify, prioritize, actually their need and to tell us where, the investment should be happening. And what type of maintenance aspect, culture, for instance, for this investment that need to be done. Who should be in charge of conducting all those things? I think those are the new, for me, paradigm that we are trying to include more and more in our intervention in countries. It has been always like this, to be honest with you. Before we were coming with almost a very pre-cooked solution, and with the money until we do that, and then we realize 5 years later the same issue happened, and we'll start from scratch. So the point that I'm trying to make, yes, it's very important to have money, to come with expertise, and to be ready to see. But however, those should support actually a pre-work that is done by the population. It has to be aligned to what the population need. And here I'm deliberately trying to make a difference between the government and the population, because we all know that one of the difficulty also that we have in most of the FCB is the legitimacy of those who are in charge of governing the country, and therefore who are also our key interlocutors. So let me stop here.
Let me just try to underline this great point you're making, which is maybe in an earlier era, if we had a session like this, we would have looked at the need for a road or building a road in the Sahel as an engineering problem. And you're saying now we see building a road as a governance problem. That ultimately it's about including the population, including the government. The engineering is a piece of it, and you might need technical expertise to come from overseas. It's possible, but really, that's not the hard part. That's not the hard part here. I am looking at the fact that we're getting a little tight on time, and I have heard Amat say many times pre-COVID and post-COVID. So I want to make sure we get to this point, which is what does this pandemic actually mean for the fragile context that we're talking about? As I said at the outset, we don't hear much about the fragile countries when we hear about the pandemic. They're not the top leading countries in the world in terms of the number of cases or deaths. So is it relevant? What does post-COVID actually mean? What does this COVID period mean for these countries? Maybe, Amat, we can start with you.
Well, I think COVID-19 has only showed us all the fragility of our entire global system. I mean, to start with, and I don't think that I'm exaggerating if I'm saying this, because the consequences and the impact of COVID, which have been very, very harsh on so many countries, but of course, the fragile countries or countries in conflict and violence have really suffered the most. And it's natural because of all the, if you will, we can here, borrow the health expression, the pre-existing condition that all these countries had. So, for example, in my own country, as you know, we have suffered for the last actually few decades, I would say, when it comes to the issue of food security. Instigating all the issues that have led to the poverty rate, which unfortunately has not been abated. I mean, including, of course, the population growth, sometimes the wrong also public policies, which haven't really dealt with all the issues that should have been dealt with. I mean, also in a form referring to development challenges or development failures. So these are issues definitely are very clear to us, for example, in my own country, that we will continue to struggle with. And also because of the combination of the violence that has been raging even during COVID. But also I wanted to say that it's not meant when we speak about how to localize all the efforts of the global development efforts. It doesn't mean that we are going to float above the real issues that those countries and contexts also have suffered, including, of course, as Osmani and Alison have stated very clearly, also questions of good governance, questions of anti-corruption, transparency of public systems. All the issues have to be really dealt with in a holistic approach, if you will. And also, it is very, very essential to continue to speak in one voice, the voice of the donor community, if you will, with the governments, with the recipient, if you will, although I don't like that term. But it's important really also to talk about responsibilities of the national authorities, of governments, of the people who are actually and who should be the first beneficiary of all these developments too. So that's a number one issue that we will continue to face. Really, food security in Yemen is of a huge impact, and it will not go, unfortunately, as you know, the question of stunting, the question of the children who cannot really bear to live or to live healthily even to the age of 18, etc., or the maternal health as well. As you know, COVID has showed us that also women suffer as well from this pandemic in a different way too, stronger, harsher too. I mean, you talk about health facilities, and they are already in a very, very difficult really shape and presence, to the extent where the first to be affected are those who are in need for it. And Yemen, of course, like most of all the other countries, with the very humble level of the health facilities that are still alive and working, we lost in Yemen a big number of the best doctors, the best nurses, the best of those first responders, and who were by even the nature of Yemen as well and its really accomplishments, who were very few. So the devastation of the outcome and the impact of COVID continue to tell us time and time again, it is more than ever essential really to call the spade a spade and to tackle all the failures from all the sides and to talk about the prospects which have to be dealt with under this really big umbrella. And it's challenging. Nobody is going to promise anybody it's going to be easy. But it's important to look at those issues, to look at the issues of accountability, transparency also of the international organizations which are working in Yemen and dealing in this fragile, context, without most of the time, for the population of Yemen, for example, having the access to knowing what exactly is going on there. And of course, vice versa. Also, the bank needs to be, open with the recipient countries, but also it's very important that the governments, the local authorities as well, have to bear all the time their most important responsibility of really showing how serious they are as well about tackling these issues. But also job creation. Creation would be the most needed now to really overcome poverty too.
Raj,
thank you for that. Alison,
Raj, if I may,
I know you need to go. Go ahead.
I have to disconnect. I have to join the board. That will start about 5 minutes. In fact, I should be in the boardroom right now. But really, I think I just would like to really to thank you, Raj, for moderating this session and for also sharing your insight with us and very well summarizing actually the point that we are trying to make. I'm sure that we'll have another opportunity, in fact, to continue this conversation, and I'm very delighted to meet with Amatalim and the other colleagues. Unfortunately, I have to disconnect.
I understand. Thank you, Osman, for joining. I know if we were in person, people would be applauding you for your great comments today. Thank you. A pleasure to see you. Alison, maybe just as we wrap up here, a final thought from you, particularly on COVID-19, what it means for fragility.
Well, I think there are others also around this table who are even better placed to answer that. But there's no question, I think, that COVID-19 there's a genuine risk that it could exacerbate a whole number of really quite fundamental and underlying challenges that already define countries that we call fragile or conflict affected. And we need to be very, very alert to that, clearly. I think this is in a way made more complex by the fact we don't have as much visibility on how COVID is potentially playing out within a number of of these contexts, takes us back to the issues of how do we know and data and all the rest. But I think it's also brings into focus the importance of development actors working much more in partnership with one another to build on their comparative strengths, to be able to share information and knowledge, to really provide the best kind of collective support to countries that are going through this horrendous crisis, which we know is horrendous everywhere, but can only really, I think, be even more horrendous in any countries that lack the institutional capability to respond. I mean, I think there is already a significant effort inside the World Bank Group to really focus on the issues of, you know, who should we care about most and first and foremost in the context of this crisis, and making sure that not just resources, but a range of supports are there for more vulnerable populations. But it's going to take some time before we know whether that's really working, and whether it's also possible, by responding to COVID and the public health emergency, it's also possible to actually imagine a development trajectory which is also more positive, actually, one which really begins to focus in on strengthening communities, on strengthening local institutions, because those are going to be vital as part of the COVID response. So that's also a possible future. I think also for evaluation and monitoring and evaluation, I think you know, there's a very strong correlation in development between the effectiveness of operations and the robustness of monitoring and evaluation. It's very well established. And I think COVID, fragility, only put that into even sharper relief. It's even more important. So we have to adapt our methods of monitoring and evaluation also to this very challenging context right now. But it's an essential part of really understanding how things are working in practice, where we need to adapt, where we need to reorient. And I can only encourage everyone working in this development field to really lean in to real-time, smart, agile forms of monitoring and evaluation as a way to really keep us on track during this crisis.
And that's a great point, I think, to close on, Alison, because, you know, it does show us that the future doesn't have to be like the past. We have a lot of new tools. We have capabilities. We can, you know, gather data in real time. We can have that more access to real-time information. We can, you know, bring together all of the technologies and the partnership opportunities that exist today. And I think that's a lot of the reason for the Fragility Forum. You know, this is a community of people who are working on these issues every day, who have their head down, working in very tough environments around the world. And this forum is a chance to kind of lift your head up and say, all right, well, what is happening? What's the broad landscape look like? What's happening across contexts? And what's happening in the future? Where are we heading? And many of those trends are awfully negative, no doubt, particularly when you think about climate and forced displacement, when you think about criminal and gang activity, when, you know, many of the themes that have come up across the 60 sessions here of the Fragility Forum. But there was also a chance. There's also an opportunity to reframe the way we think about these issues, as you and Amat have so eloquently described, to think about the populations we're trying to serve as being at the core of the solution, not just beneficiaries or victims, but really the people who will solve these problems. And as Usman described, having a positive vision for countries that might seem hopeless in kind of modern parlance, the way we think about them, basket case countries, these kinds of terms that you hear people throw around. Actually, these are countries with a rich history and potentially with a great future. We have to think through what the opportunity is to get there. But I hope this forum has helped inspire everybody who's been a part of it to think in these new ways. And I thank our participants on the panel today. I want to thank you, Amat Alim Al-Soswa. I want to thank Alison Evans, Usman. Thank you so much for being a part of this today. My great thanks to the organizers for inviting me here again and putting on all of these sessions. It's been a pleasure to partner with you, and especially to the audience, the people all over the world following along and being part of this this session today. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for the important work that you do every day. Be well.